You can hear me?
Yes.
Woo! The conversation was actually not just specifically technology, but the interplay between democracy and openness, and in terms of all different sorts of openness. And I thought I'd just use this talk, and this is what I propose, to sort of reflect on some lessons learnt about things that are not as, about what the relationship between democracy and openness is, and why we need to focus on some systemic change around more openness in democracy in order to make sure we have better democracy. I can sort of reflect on some of the experience that I have, both working in government, private sector, advocating for change both outside government and inside the government, and just seeing how those things worked. So, I guess the first thing I want to say is my observation, and I can probably get into all kinds of debates with people about this, but my observation is that democracy without openness leads you away from democracy. It may not in the very first instance, but over time it does. Openness becomes the mechanism by which you set up what I like to call a natural motivation to do the right thing. When you don't have openness, it becomes too easy. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but at some point for someone to take the expedient path. And with the expedient path becomes the next expedient path, and you start to lose the integrity of what it is the system is supposed to do. So from my perspective, part of the reason I've been so involved in the open government movement, the Gov2O movement, whatever you want to call it, is around this idea that I believe very strongly that openness is a core founding principle of what makes democracy work. As we all know, Churchill's comment about, democracy is a terrible system of governance, but it's the least terrible. That's probably true as well. But I do think it's the best system that we have. And I think in Australia in particular, we actually have one of the best democracies in the world. That is not at all commenting about politics. Let's just be clear. Our system of democracy is one of the best in the world. Doesn't mean we can be lax about it. We have to be on the ball, and we have to be figuring out how to introduce more openness and more democratic rigour into the system all the time, with everything else changing as well. But we're starting from a pretty good basis here, certainly compared to a lot of other countries. As a quick example, I went to Mongolia. Mongolia is an amazing country, amazing people, amazing culture. But one of the things that really struck me is that they, the combination that they have of how they interpret democracy and capitalism. So what they've effectively got is a system that says, well, their first president actually campaigned on the slogan, "Let's all get rich," in '91. That doesn't really set it up necessarily in the way that maybe some of us would think would be important from a democratic perspective. But politicians are expected by the public to, you'll have the Minister of Transport will actually give his own company all of the contracts. The company will fulfill all the contracts, making stupid amounts of money, and then before the road is opened, will go and cut large car-sized chunks out of the road and then put in a tender to do the repairs to the road. An infant item, right? So you've got systems of politicians making stupid amounts of money through very corrupt practices, but there's a cultural expectation that that's okay because, the politician needs to recoup the investment they made in getting elected. I heard someone actually say that to me, and I was gobsmacked, right? So the cultural expectation in some places is very low, starting from a low basis, and at the same time there's an assumption that, regulation's bad and we're just all going to make money. So we're starting from a reasonable starting point here, but there's a lot that needs to be done. So if we agree that openness is a good mechanism for driving natural motivation, because then you can also expect that it's good motivation for driving evidence-based policy. Has anyone ever heard the term evidence-based policy? A few? Yep, cool. A bunch in this room, excellent. I'm sure all of you will giggle when I mention the next phrase then, policy-based evidence. Policy-based evidence, when I first heard that term used in jest, I went, oh, that's rather funny and clever and witty. Oh shit, you're serious. We have what's happened over a number of years in Australia, and this is only my personal observation, is there has been a deviation away from evidence-based policy. And there's a whole bunch of reasons around that, and I don't want to go into all of the reasons why. What I'd like to do is to talk about why it's important that we pull that back. Obviously, we should be making decisions based on evidence. Part of the reason is because you get a better decision, right? But part of the reason also is because then you're creating, again, a natural motivation for the decision makers, who are, often politicians or high-level people in public service. You're creating a natural motivation for them to choose the path of integrity, the path of sustainability, and the path of the better technical outcome of whatever the thing is. So over many years of a lot of public servants getting sick of trying to, and there is a bit of a culture change in the public service happening right now, and it is, although it's a difficult place to work in at times, it is wonderful to see so many people in the public service genuinely wanting to change things for the better and get back to a more evidence-based approach. Part of the reason for that is a lot of people have suffered under this approach. They've seen good ideas be not implemented. They've seen bad ideas be implemented. There's it can be quite heartbreaking, actually, to try to drive something good and then to have it not done right or not done at all. So evidence-based approach and public engagement in policy development then becomes a mechanism for the public service to encourage all of the other decision makers involved in that system to actually take the most evidence-based approach. So when I was working for a senator, and again, I didn't join parties. I don't actually like parties. I think they get in the way of democracy a bit. But it was very interesting to see how the system worked, which is why I took the job, because I wanted to understand how something goes from being a twinkle in someone's eye to being a policy, a program, something funded and implemented by government. And it was fascinating to see that in play. What we experimented with was what we called the public sphere, which was a methodology of doing public policy development where we cooperatively designed the policy with the public. And then what you get is a couple of things. So with traditional consultations that a few people here have participated in, and by the way, I just want to send out a huge thank you and to the LA and OSIA people for all of the amazing contributions you've done to government. It's just fantastic. I'm catching up with all the reading because of maternity leave, but it's just wonderful to continue to see the community agitating. But what we found was that a lot of traditional consultations, they open the door and say, send us your paper, and then usually they'll publish those papers afterwards. But if an entity sends a paper into government and says, oh, this is commercial in confidence, then you can't publish it, right? When you can't publish someone's submission, they can say whatever they want, and you don't have the benefit of the peer review that we all take, that we all just do intuitively to make sure that they're actually saying something sensible. Public policy development is how we get the best ideas, we get checks and balances, and we actually get a way of saying, here is what experts across the country and possibly further have said is the best way to go, and here's the evidence we've been able to collect about that, and here's all of the background about other ways that have been tried that people have given us. So here's the right way to go, Minister. And then the Minister, if the Minister wants to go in a different direction, they are our elected representatives, and that is their prerogative, but they're going to be motivated to follow a better path, I would suggest. So openness helps like that. It helps make all bugs shallow, as we all know, because security or policy, or indeed anything else through obscurity, doesn't work over time. And so part of that openness ends up being openness of decision-making, openness of policy development, open data. Obviously, I'm pretty personally invested in. But going much further, if you only stay with open data, then you're missing the point. There's a culture shift towards an openness, which is really important. So I gave a speech a few years ago about I called it collaborative innovation, and I said up front that it was a totally made-up term, right? And they were like, oh, okay, because I hadn't heard about that one. Okay, good. The concept of collaborative innovation is open source, right? The concept was you shouldn't start from what do I have to do and how much time and money do I have to do it, so what's the most of the thing I need to do, because I can never afford to do all I need to do. How much can I do with what I have available to me? Collaborative innovation says, there is inevitably someone else out there that's trying to do something similar to you. There are inevitably allies you have across other departments, across other governments, private sector, citizens. The concept of even talking to citizens is like trying to have a discussion about Game of Thrones. It's just, but why would we lower the moat and let people stampede us? I'm like, no. You are just a node in a network. You are just a node in a network. You are no more special than the citizen that's trying to actually tell you a better way of doing things. So start seeing the world in that way and we have a different discussion. Where was I going with that? So the point of trying to get that culture shift, and collaborative innovation was about understand who your natural allies are. Reach out to them. What have they already done? Maybe we could build on the shoulders of giants. Maybe we could use what's already out there. Maybe we could collaborate on a solution that meets all of our needs. And then, of course, no one can own the intellectual property, so we better share that openly. And people are like, wow, this is revolutionary. And I'm just going, what we do works. We know it works. So it's really just about helping other people on that journey. So open source is actually a critical part of it, and not just in terms of methodology, but in many, many ways. And I should also say, whenever I talk about open data, everyone always brings up whatever the latest privacy issue is, and I just want to say, absolutely in front of you all, obviously, I am personally absolutely committed to privacy, and I do everything that I can in my power to stop those things happening, but I'm only one person. Please don't see me as a lightning rod for all the problems of government. I'm doing my best, I promise. Okay. Public servants are increasingly motivated to try more openness to get better outcomes, because fundamentally a lot of them have tried everything else. So there's new things being experimented with, which is really cool. If we start looking at other forms of openness, Australia has, and please don't laugh, but we have what the British call responsible government as part of our mandate. Responsible government means that our executives are directly elected as a way of improving accountability. And it does improve accountability to a point, because if a politician does completely something so abhorrent, there is a better chance of them being voted out locally. So it does create a new pressure, but of course it creates multiple masters. And one of the things I did want to bring up is about party policy development. How many people here have been involved in a party? Okay, actually not that many. So, and funnily enough, that actually represents this statistic too. When over 60% of Australians were a member of a political party, the premise that you could build the party policy platform amongst your members, and then when you get elected, that's a representative platform, was correct. Now, with something less than 2% of the general population involved in a party, I think there's a serious question we need to ask about how representative a party platform can possibly be when at best it represents 1% of the population. So there's an interesting question about political participation, what it means to be a legitimate government today. If you get elected, have you been elected with a mandate to do everything you said you would? Because most people are actually voting either against one or two things or for one or two things. I don't think anyone agrees with everything. So what does legitimacy mean? Is it something you have to earn maybe on a daily basis? Is it something you need to be engaging with people on? Is it, or can you just, close shop and say, oh, well, you elected us and so we can do everything we said we were going to do because that's the mandate that we have? Popular polling would say no. But then again, popular polling has been part of the problem. So I think that that's become a little bit unrepresentative and a little bit of a question we need to ask. Now, inability of public servants to participate in public dialogue is one thing I did want to bring up. How many people here are or have been a public servant? A few? So if you want to, whenever everyone loves to kick public servants, everyone. I have regular arguments with my dad where he tells me that I don't do anything because I'm a public servant. It is infuriating. I understand the frustration, and I understand why everyone likes to kick the public servant, because everyone wants someone to blame for the issues that go wrong. Unfortunately, what it actually does is I've never felt, personally, I'm just speaking completely personally here, I've never felt more repressed as a citizen as I have being a public servant. I'm expected to not speak, both from internally and externally. I'm expected to, the expectations are just ridiculous. And in Australia, we have something in the realms of, I figured it out a while ago, it was like 700,000 or 800,000 public servants across all the federal and state governments. I don't know how many in the locals as well. There's a lot of public servants in this country that are second-rate citizens. And at the same time, a lot of those people, not all, but a lot of those people have the frontline experience and expertise and willingness to try to improve the place, but they're not allowed to participate in the conversation. Now that's slowly changing. There are some departments that are a lot better than others. I've worked for a couple of departments that have been fantastic. I've worked for one which was ridiculously stupid. But generally speaking, it is getting better. But we need to ask that question. Why is it that we all want to, kick all the public servants? I have, when I first started in the public service, I was going to, I've told people this a few times, it kind of makes the point, I was going to start an anonymous cartoon. But as you saw in the keynote this morning, my skills are definitely not mad skills. So but I was going to start a cartoon, and the first thing was going to be someone saying to me, I'm surprised that you're working in government. I would have thought that you'd disagree with X, Y, Z. Okay. The second panel is someone saying to me, oh, I just can't believe you're working in government. I thought you had integrity, because I thought you would have disagreed with all of these things. I'm like, okay. And then the third person says, you mother... Anyway, goes on a complete tirade. I probably get hit in the head. The fourth panel is me running off in the distance into the sunset, and the three people saying to each other, why are there no good people in government? One of the best pieces of advice I got coming into the public service from someone who's turned out to be quite a mentor, actually, was propose solutions, not just problems. And I think that's really useful. And the sort of submissions that LA and Aussie have been doing is wonderful, because there's a lot of solutions being proposed there. But it's really easy to say, you've done that really badly. If you can say, here's a better way of doing it, people do want to listen. They generally do want to do the right thing. They generally want to get things better. And of course, there is a whole... I just want to be clear, I'm talking about the public sector now, not the political sector, almost entirely in what I'm talking about. Most people don't differentiate. Most people see government as government, and it's all one big multi-headed animal. But it's not a multi-headed animal. It's many animals that are competing with each other, and at the top side, the people holding the leashes are a whole different beast. Anyway, so in terms of open source, it was actually covered pretty well by the previous talk, so I don't really need to cover that too much at all. But I thought that talking about openness more broadly, talking about some of these systemic changes that would actually help drive more openness would be good. And part of that openness as well is the work that our and the broader community does to hold government to account. If the citizens aren't engaged in holding government to account, then again, what point is openness? So I just want to take a moment to say a huge personal and professional thank you to everyone that's been involved in any of the open government movements, open data movements, the Open Australias and such. All of those sort of projects, all of them help contribute to better government. So thank you to all of you. And the final thing I'll say in terms of openness is not just opening up data, but opening up systems and documentation, and starting to have, if we get back to that concept of more collaborative approach to government, rather than assuming that we need to figure out what people's tolerance for something is and then just go only to that level, just having the public conversation. Australia Card was mentioned before, and it's been fascinating to watch people in government just kind of tiptoe around and say, well, we can't possibly talk about this, 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 or this, and you say, why? Oh, well, Australia Card. And I'm like, well, hold on a second. Why don't we have the conversation publicly? Why aren't we saying, what do you want from government? What is the appropriate role of government? How do you want us to use or not use, data and all these kinds of things? And let's come up with that social contract. Let's actually take a collaborative approach to designing how government should operate in the future, as opposed to just, again, iterating on the past. Okay, that was pretty much what I was going to cover. I'm sure there's going to be a few questions, so what do you reckon?
Questions?
I was really interested in the collaborative policy development, Pia. If you could just tell maybe an example of a policy that was collaboratively developed and what happened, and I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, sure. Okay. Actually, I'll tell you a good story and a bad story. So we ran a series of consultations around policy at the time. I'm going to tell you 3 really quick ones because they're really interesting. Right, so the first one was particularly interesting. So I was working for a senator who, when she was Shadow Minister of IT, had strongly opposed internet filtering. Her government, while she was on the backbench, proposed internet filtering. She, which is the main reason I worked for her, had enormous integrity and went, well, this is a bad idea. I've opposed it before. I'm going to continue to oppose it. But what we saw internally was almost all the political officers were getting absolutely a barrage of paper correspondence, letters from people saying that filtering was a good idea. And the problem was that they weren't really getting a whole bunch of feedback from people saying it was a terrible idea, apart from people saying, very nasty things, or emails. And at that time, email wasn't considered as representative as a letter, which again is stupid, as we know, but that's changed now, but that was the case back then. And she could see that her colleagues were being convinced on something that wasn't necessarily representative of the broader community. So she took a huge professional risk and blogged about, I posed this before, here's the reasons I think it's a pretty bad idea. What do you reckon? Oh my God, so I was in charge of moderating. And we did this just before Christmas, so I spent 2 weeks myself, pretty much, with her. I mean, she was obviously involved as well, but we had thousands of comments, thousands and thousands and thousands, and well-articulated, well-researched, well-argued, sort of commentary. And suddenly, it opened up a conversation across her colleagues. What does this mean? And we could suddenly have a really good conversation. So that was a good example. It wasn't entirely public policy co-development, but it's an interesting example of trying to get that representative approach. The public policy, public spheres that we ran one around broadband at the time, one around the ICT industry development, one around, there was the new policy that was being developed around creative industries, so we did one with creative industries. That's the one I'm probably most proud of, because we engaged with a whole bunch of different industries, and industries that the Department of Arts hadn't even thought about. I'm like, well, the gaming sector. Oh, well, that's an interesting idea. Oh, yeah, okay, let's have a talk to them. And I'm like, anyway, mad gamer than I am. So we ran a big public consultation, ended up with a paper, ended up with a lot of submissions, and the minister took it as part of an official submission, and a whole bunch of the ideas were actually adopted into the paper. Gov 2.0, we ran a public sphere. In fact, we launched the Gov 2.0 public policy consultation at a public sphere around Gov 2.0. Inception. Anyway, and that paper and those contributions were heavily listened to by the people that wrote the paper, and they ended up adopting a lot of the recommendations from the public. Not to say at all that those processes were perfect. They absolutely could have been iterated further, but this brings me to the third story, and this is the funny one. So those were quite successful. Good input, very constructive, wonderful collaborative approach to what could the policies of the future be. So I was called into a political office, which I will not name, and I won't name, by the chief of staff for that office, and I was asked, oh, this public sphere thing, can you just brief me on it, because we're going to run one for our thing, which I'm not going to name. And I was like, oh, okay, so we're having this conversation, it's going back and forth, and it just felt wrong to me. I didn't know why, it just felt wrong. And so being the cantankerous little person that I am, I started pushing her. I started saying, well, what are you doing? Wait, why would you do that? No. And finally she lost her temper and slammed her hand down on the table and said, Pia, people should feel privileged. We're letting them have a say at all. Win! So I laughed, which she was deeply uncomfortable about. And I said, junior staffer that I was, and I said, thank you for saying that. I understand now why this conversation is not working, and I can tell you now, I can give you the best process in the world. I could run it for you, but you don't actually want to hear from people, so it will fail. And it did, by the way, which I then wrote up a very scathing report about how they failed in every respect, which they didn't like very much. But it's the key thing. A lot of government consultation used to be actually a communication mechanism, not a consultation mechanism. And it's often, not always, it's often been seen as a checkbox. I need to consult because I'm told I have to consult, check, I've consulted, but they don't actually expect to get value. That whole culture has started to shift. People in the public service have started to go, actually, public consultation can improve and enhance and indeed give us whole new ideas that we haven't thought of before, but that's relatively new. So yeah, there's a couple examples. Sorry, that was longer than expected. Sorry.
We're officially out of time.
Sorry.
So if people want to go out for the break, they can, but if they want to stay informally, then Pia, you're under no obligation to stay.
See ya. No, I'm here. I'm cool. Okay. Any other questions? I'm happy to take. If anyone else has other questions, please do.
So technically, for the recording, it is now afternoon tea time, so if you want to go off and refresh yourselves, if you want to stay here and interrogate Pia further, then I think there was a question here at the front.
Yeah. Oh, shit.